One of the most devastating types of anecdotes to hear are ones of abuse. Whether it be young adults, mothers, friends, or children, all stories are equally as heartbreaking. It is both gut-wrenching and relieving to know that opening up the discussion around the topic allows people to mourn, recover, and process their horrifying commonalities. The sheer multitude of psychological and emotional effects childhood trauma has had on young adults are extremely profound and impact their success as well as their ability to stay mentally healthy. One of the most common places we find upsetting stories like these is in narratives. Whether it be a bestseller book you happen to pick up, like It Ends With Us, or a hit TV show on Netflix like Outer Banks, childhood abuse is being portrayed more often than not in popular narratives. Although relatively romanticized, most of these narratives accurately represent that statistical significant effects childhood trauma can have on young adults with their storylines. All of this is to ask a simple yet quite complex question. How accurately are the effects of childhood abuse and trauma found in scholarly sources, portrayed in narratives, and how are they displayed through characters' mental health in adolescence and their future success? Here is my claim that I concluded through my exploration. The statistical effects of childhood abuse on adolescent mental health, depressive symptoms, and school dropout rates is adequately portrayed by characters who experience trauma in various forms of narrative. To begin, it is important to first evaluate our factual-based scholarly sources to identify the key aspects and symptoms of childhood abuse and trauma that we can use to evaluate our general sources later. The first article explored was in regards to the correlation between childhood traumatic experience and depressive symptoms, recorded through adolescence and adulthood. Furthermore, the study hones in on exploring whether loneliness acts as a potential mediator between childhood trauma and depressive symptoms. In terms of conducting the study, Laurent Fan assessed a sample of college students and analyzed results using an online questionnaire on a platform called WeChat, a patient health questionnaire, and the University of Los Angeles Loneliness Scale. Aiming at a general audience, Fan attempts to convince the reader that there is a strong correlation between childhood trauma and depressive symptoms among young adults. He attempts to emphasize the importance of examining loneliness in all individuals who have suffered through childhood trauma in order to prevent and treat any developing depressive symptoms amongst victims. Although Fan's argument proves a significant point, it is vital to recognize that all young adults may not have the resources and outlets to address their developing mental health issues. Fan's argument here is very resource dependent. Additionally, there are some limitations of the study, including that the sample was completely made up of college students and did not include peers who did not attend college. Lastly, there could be other possible mediators that were ignored in the mediation analysis, such as PTSD, coping styles, and anxiety. Despite this, as you can see in this graph and provided explanation, it can be claimed that childhood trauma can have a positive correlation with depressive symptoms in young adults as well as loneliness. Additionally, as seen here, I think it is significant to point out the effects of gender, family relationships, and left behind experience on the data. It is beneficial in terms of understanding and recognizing how the study took into consideration other possible contributing variables that could have affected the results. Moving on to our second scholarly article, it explored evaluations of childhood trauma and its correlation to high school dropouts in the United States. Michelle Porche attempts to contribute to the existing studies that have provided evidence regarding long-term consequences of childhood adverse experiences and their relation to adult psychiatric disorders and suicidal ideation by introducing possible new effects. To do this, Porche estimated the weighing rates for dropouts and tested the association of childhood traumatic stress and childhood use of mental health services to the dropout status. Porche attempts to convince the reader that experience of early trauma will be positively correlated with school dropout rates and that psychiatric disorders work as a mediator. With the likely intended audience being mental health professionals or psychologists, Porche emphasized that mental health services can be used as a protective layer against school dropout rates amongst affected individuals. In her analysis of dropout programs supported by the U.S. Department of Education, there were multiple factors identified, including a need for greater attention to psychological factors in developing programs and that target dropout prevention. Portia's data clearly supports her argument that trauma and dropout rates are positively correlated. However, given the impact of poverty on educational attainment, the study is limited by the lack of information regarding family income during childhood. Despite this, as seen in the graph of the study, indicates that individuals who reported childhood diagnosis of conduct disorder or substance abuse were among 2 times more likely to drop out of school. This can be related back to our first scholarly source, as it is once again proven that there are a plethora of adverse childhood trauma effects provided in adolescence. Overall, given the positive correlation between childhood trauma and school dropout rates, in this study, it can be concluded that childhood trauma does indeed contribute to young adult success rates. Now that we have evaluated the factual-based evidence in scholarly sources, we can apply the findings to our assessment of multiple forms of narrative. With the adverse effects of childhood trauma in mind, we can first look at the widely popular TV show Outer Banks. Outer Banks blew away audiences when it hit Netflix over the summer in 2020. In order to accurately gauge the comparison between the scholarly sources and this TV show, let's hone in on one character's experience. JJ. One of the main characters has faced some extremely difficult encounters through his living situation. Growing up with his abusive father, JJ viewed his friends in the Outer Banks as his true family and would do anything to be with them and escape his situation at home. After getting into a very aggressive fight with his father and receiving a very brutal beating, the psychological effect JJ's trauma was taking on him became very apparent. His friends showed up to see him smoking and drinking in a hot tub, which he spent all of this restitution money on and its life savings. He then stood up and gave an emotional speech about how they were all he has, revealing his bruises when doing so. It is clear through this scene that JJ's childhood trauma has directly affected his mental health in a negative way as a young adult. Additionally, in relation to the second scholarly source, it is reasonable to conclude that his abuse has also contributed to his lack of success as an adolescent, since he dropped out of high school junior year and has been living off of limited food and resources. The writers had a clear intention to highlight these detrimental effects of childhood trauma, as they are more relevant in the real world than we may believe. These emotional anecdotes and physical effects in this scene brought the objective to life in an informative and visual way, as seen by these images. Overall, JJ's complex and multifaceted character development further supports that argument that statistical effects of childhood abuse on adolescent mental health is adequately portrayed in characters who experience trauma in narratives. Now switching focus to a written form of narrative. The best-selling novel It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover has recently skyrocketed in sales due to the emotional and vindictive romantic storyline it holds. Most important to our use, it is in essence the poster child when looking to assess the effects of childhood trauma in a novel. Specifically, the book emphasizes the power psychological stress can have over a relationship and the long-term effects childhood trauma can have on someone's life and choices. Lily, the protagonist of the novel, grew up witnessing her father abuse her mother on a daily basis. Lily not only watched as her father drained her mother's self-respect, but also was faced with the fact that her mother continued to stay in her marriage. Despite insisting she would never tolerate any behavior in a relationship close to her father's like her mother did, Lily finds herself in a very similar situation with the protagonist Ryle, which replicates this idea that childhood has a direct impact on her decisions as adolescents. It is clear throughout the novel that Lily's childhood trauma significantly affected her own relationship as a young adult and contributed to her enduring and condoning abusive behavior from Ryle. This representation is more accurate than many may think, as there have been many psychological studies that have proved observing a continuous repetitive action as a child can lead to an adoption of that trait or action. This is referred to as modeling in the psychological realm. As seen by this quote, when Lily confronts her mother, it is clear that Lily struggles from significant mental health issues due to her exposure to destructive and harmful abusive behavior as a child and her evident unresolved feelings. Because of this, it is reasonable to conclude that the data found within studies regarding a correlation between young adults' mental health and their childhood trauma is reflected in Hoover's novel and represented throughout the protagonist's complex relationship as an adult. Now, despite the adverse mental health effects being clearly presented and apparent in both the TV show and novel, it is important to acknowledge the harsh reality that many writers and creators choose to glamorize. In regards to the provided examples, Some of the negative outcomes of the childhood trauma were slightly romanticized by the writers, unlike the staggering statistics. This may be due to a writer's fear of lower ratings, viewership, or reviews, as a certain audience could be veered in another direction if the true effects were shown more graphically or descriptively. However, it is still evident in both sources that the writers intended to share a message regarding childhood trauma to the audience and spread awareness. So where does this leave us? Each of these sources provided a unique perspective regarding the role of childhood trauma and how it plays a role on young adults' mental health and success as they enter adulthood. Hoover hones in on the psychological effects childhood abuse can have on a victim's relationship. Pate evaluates the correlation between childhood abuse and decision-making as an adolescent. In both scholarly sources, studies were completed that highlighted the positive correlation between high school dropouts and childhood trauma, as well as depressive symptoms. And together, these sources all collaborate to form a broader discussion and cohesive picture of the relationship between childhood trauma and depressive symptoms in both real life and narratives. So how can we get a definitive answer in regards to the accuracy of the portrayal of childhood trauma's effects in narratives? The simple answer is we can't. Although my argument leads towards narratives being good representations of the negative effects of childhood trauma, and the examples were fairly spot on, the shock and devastation that the statistical data provides is extremely hard to replicate. The harsh reality of our society is that we do not provide enough resources to assist those struggling through grief and psychological pain post-childhood stress. This lack of addressment then contributes to measurable effects and is a fascinating topic that opens up a complex discussion and should be more frequently recognized in narratives so it can be normalized to talk about.